Hi everyone. Before we get into today's episode, I'd like to mention a couple things related to the show. If you've enjoyed Henry Wilson and the Civil War so far, please subscribe and leave a review on whatever platform you're listening to. Also, if you're interested in more Henry Wilson content, check out HenryWilsonHistory.com. Also on the website, you can find the newly opened podcast store, where you can order stickers or make a donation. I always appreciate your feedback and support. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never be forgotten what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they have gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. That's the Gettysburg Address, given by President Abraham Lincoln on November 19, 1863. This is Henry Wilson and the Civil War. 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln joined hundreds of others in the dedication ceremony of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Like so many battles of the Civil War, a large number of remains could not be identified and were buried at the site of the battlefield. After a 2-hour oration by Edward Everett, the former senator whose seat Henry Wilson succeeded, President Abraham Lincoln rose and delivered his 272-word speech that Everett characterized as being more powerful in 2 minutes than his was in 2 hours. Lincoln's short words characterized the entire meaning of the war and gave meaning to the great losses the war had dealt. The Gettysburg Address, as it's now known, is remembered as one of the greatest speeches in American history. For the past 2 years, Wilson had forcefully been pushing Lincoln to seek the recruitment of more black soldiers. Wilson believed that if black Americans were viewed as helping the war effort, racist whites would be more likely to support expanding civil rights. In February 1863, Wilson supported Massachusetts Governor John A. Andrews' call to raise 1,000 black soldiers for the Massachusetts militia. The 54th Massachusetts became the first black regiment in the nation and became the first black regiment to lead a charge in July. By late 1863, over 50,000 black troops were serving in the Union Army. Wilson was happy black Americans now took on this role of leadership in the Army, but he was upset with their conditions. Black soldiers received crummy equipment and inadequate supplies compared to their white counterparts. Blacks also received lower pay than white soldiers. White officers received $13 with a $3.50 allowance for clothes. Black soldiers earned $10 with $3 deducted from their pay for uniforms. In the early months of 1864, Wilson introduced a bill to fix these inequalities and better improve the conditions of black soldiers in the Army. Wilson also fought for the freeing of soldiers' families. Wilson's bills faced intense criticism, especially regarding the freeing of soldiers' wives. Slave states did not recognize slave marriages, and therefore made it legally impossible for the wives of black soldiers to be freed. How Congress would find out who the soldiers were married to offered logistical and moral complications. Wilson suggested that wives be considered anyone who reasonably embodied the traditional relationship between a husband and wife. Wilson argued, quote, "How can you go to a man and ask him to enlist in the fight of the battles of his country, when he knows the moment his back is turned, his wife and children will be sold to strangers?" End quote. Though Wilson's vision for equal rights failed to come to fruition here, he continued his fight for the equal treatment of black Americans. Wilson and Sumner worked to pass a bill that banned the segregation of black people on trains, and successfully pressured Secretary of War Stanton to form an investigative commission on the conditions of free blacks across the country and how the federal government could best serve the freed people. Wilson aspired to ensure that black Americans would be given the tools to raise themselves to success following the war. Wilson knew that people with black skin were of equal mental superiority to all others, and believed if given the resources and rights they had been deprived of, they could reach the high achievements of success they were deserving of. Throughout 1863, representatives in both chambers of Congress faced special elections. These elections would be a good indication for how Republicans would fare in the upcoming election of 1864. Lincoln had grown to become deeply unpopular in some circles, especially as the war became more unpopular. A growing faction of Copperheads, Democrats who opposed the war, continued to launch attacks against the Lincoln administration for their supposed handling of the war. On the other end, passionate anti-slavery groups viewed Lincoln with skepticism and began to talk of a contested Republican convention in 1864. Wilson, being the one most able to unify divisions and satisfy all sides, was sought by Lincoln to wrangle the party and ensure success for the Republicans in the elections of 1863, in order to not only cement the power of Republicans in Congress, but to also begin good feelings before the impending 1864 election. Wilson, who had been attacked by Copperheads for his creation of the draft, decided to stand firm in the face of criticism and defend his position, while bolstering the reputations of the Lincoln administration. Once again, Wilson traveled the North, campaigning and speaking to groups of thousands. Republicans feared New York would fall to Democrats, as the state had always held a pro-slavery faction and had faced tremendous riots in reaction to the drafts in the months before the vote. Wilson worked hard to campaign in New York and did his best to quell voters' fears regarding the violence, war, and Lincoln. Beyond the average white voter, Wilson needed to speak to ease the rejection of Lincoln by his fellow abolitionists. Just years before the war, strong anti-slavery individuals had disregarded Wilson as a sellout to the cause of freedom. But once the war gave him the opportunity to fight for civil rights and emancipation, he once again became a hero of abolition. Knowing the trust other anti-slavery voters enshrined in him, Wilson attempted to associate the president more closely to the abolitionist causes, despite trying to push the president further behind the scenes. Wilson praised the president for the Emancipation Proclamation and pledged that they would continue to work for the promotion of freedom going forward. Wilson's hard campaigning proved to be successful as Republicans expanded their majority to 2/3 in the Senate. While Republicans still held a large contingency in the House, they lost 21 seats in the 1863 election season. Even though Republicans continued to hold a strong grip of power in the defining year of the war, there was still another year before the presidential election, and success was still unclear. Wilson's son, Henry Hamilton, was now 17. The once young and hardy baby was now becoming a man, ready to fight for the cause of his nation. After graduating from a military academy in Worcester, Massachusetts, and being accepted into the United States Naval Academy at West Point, Hamilton was appointed to become the first lieutenant of the Union Army's 31st Colored Troops Regiment, which consisted nearly entirely of black soldiers. The regiment served in the Battle of Cold Harbor and in the siege of Petersburg and Richmond in the later months of 1864. Wilson wrote a letter to his son, saying in part, quote, "We have not heard from you for many days. Your mother writes often, but you do not write often in reply. Let us hear from you every week, and let us know how you are getting on in everything. I want before you go home to hear from you, so write me a good long letter." End quote. While Wilson's son was now engaged in the fight for the restoration of the Union and the cause of freedom, the war raged on. Since 1862, Abraham Lincoln had been requesting Congress reinstate the position of Lieutenant General of the Union Army. This position had been first established by George Washington in 1798, though with little exception, the rank had been out of commission since 1799. Lincoln wanted the rank in order to have a better handling of the Army during his discontent with the current leader of the war in the form of the commander of the Army of the Potomac, which was held first by McClellan, then Hooker, now Meade. The rank of lieutenant general is a more general role and is only answerable to the president, giving Lincoln more grip on the war. Unless Lincoln chose Union General Ulysses Grant, who had proven to be a robust and successful leader, Congress refused to grant Lincoln's request. Lincoln feared that choosing Grant would bump his popular status, fearing Grant would run against him in the Republican primary in 1864. General Grant dismissed these fears in early 1864, and in March Lincoln appointed Grant as the Lieutenant General of the Union Army, hoping his appointment would lead to better control of the war and its aspired end. In September 1864, another general, General William Tecumseh Sherman, an interesting figure in himself, led his forces to the capture of Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta had been a prize of the Confederacy due to its robust industry and because it was the hub of most of the rebels' supplies. The fall of Atlanta signaled to both sides that the South's fate was steadily approaching. Once Atlanta was captured, Confederate troops fled west in an attempt to ward off northern encroachments to the western southern states. If you're not familiar where Atlanta is, I encourage you to check out one of the war maps available on HenryWilsonHistory.com. But to save you the hassle, Atlanta is about in the middle of where the Confederacy was, giving Sherman a strategic opportunity to attack the South from within. Sherman split his men up, directing half to go towards the west in Tennessee and Alabama to defend and push back rebel forces, while he and the other half would go on the offensive in the east towards Savannah, Georgia. Sherman believed that the Confederacy had a weak fighting force, but a strong moral and economic infrastructure keeping them alive and passionate. The general reasoned that since it was the morale and industry that kept the South vibrant, in order to destroy rebellion, these factors needed to be destroyed as well. From November to December, Sherman, on his over 60,000-man march, crossed Georgia, enacting a strategy of total war, destroying farms, stealing food, twisting railroads, and crushing any spirit the people of Georgia had. Sherman's activities were brutal and destructive. In a letter home, one of General Sherman's men wrote that they had to teach Georgia a lesson. Quote, "It isn't so sweet to secede as they once thought it would be." End quote. While Sherman's tactics are controversial and still debated today, it's clear that Sherman's march to the sea and his capture of both Atlanta and Savannah dragged the South closer to surrender. 1864 was not only a big year for the military, but for politics as well. As the Union entered the presidential year, not only were Democrats wary of the president, but so too were many factions of Republicans. Throughout the war, many Republicans had turned against renominating the president in 1864, and Lincoln was sure to face a challenger at the convention. Some more radical Republicans felt that Lincoln moved with too much caution in securing rights to African Americans and squashing the rebellion. Henry Wilson stood beside the president, seeing the characteristics of Lincoln's pragmatic progress unfold, a strategy that Wilson championed. Though he never contended that Lincoln was perfect or doing the most for blacks, Wilson spoke of his optimism and hope for the president's reelection. Though Lincoln had usurped many of his former opponents into his cabinet in the election of 1860, a few serious contenders remained, like Salmon Chase, John C. Fremont, and General Ben Butler, though only Fremont would result in a serious challenge. Wilson and other Lincolnites worked tirelessly to convince delegates to support Lincoln at the convention on May 31st. The Third Republican Convention met in Baltimore. One of the first orders of business in the packed hall was to change the name of the party to the National Union Party. The delegates hoped the rebrand would bring along pro-war Democrats and stop anti-war Copperhead Democrats. Despite so much worrying for so long, the Republicans knew that the start of bringing the Union together was ensuring that their party was unified as well. With no serious candidate taking charge, the convention unanimously selected Abraham Lincoln to lead them through the next 4 uncertain years. When it came time to choose a vice presidential nominee, Wilson had been passionate in pushing delegates to support the current vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, so long as Wilson did, though Lincoln decided to take a different approach. Lincoln pushed for the nomination of Southern Democrat Andrew Johnson. Johnson is an interesting figure who we'll look at much closer in a future episode. Lincoln chose Johnson in another attempt to compel Democrats to vote for the National Union ticket and show that Republicans were in favor of unification rather than partisan polarization, but Wilson felt Johnson would lose more votes than gain. The Democrats nominated former commander of the Union Army, George McClellan. If you remember last episode, we went over Lincoln and McClellan's split. The Democrats endorsed a peace plan that would have essentially recognized the Confederacy and ended the war, though McClellan opposed the strategy personally and wanted to see the continuation of the war until the nation was unified. Wilson, as always, tirelessly campaigned for Lincoln and Johnson, speaking to hundreds of thousands throughout the campaign period. In a letter filled with blunt assessments of Lincoln's standing in military circles, Wilson wrote to Lincoln, quote, "We are to have a terrible contest. Let us not throw away any help. If we are beaten, our friends will cast the blame wholly on you, for they believe they can carry the country easy with another candidate. You must lose no time in the work of putting all our friends in the fight. I have written it as a friend of our cause and a friend of your election. Read it, then destroy it." End quote. Wilson feared many soldiers had lost so much confidence in the fighting and had wanted to see Lincoln's prolonged war ended. In a close election, the number of anti-Lincoln men in the Army could tilt it to the former general. After hard-fought campaigning, Election Day came. In a devastating and bloody Civil War, the American experiment was still working. Union soldiers received ballots by mail. The nation's people was to decide its fate. When the ballots were tallied, George McClellan received around 1,800,000 votes, about the same Lincoln had won in 1860. Though McClellan and the Democrats posed a tough fight, Abraham Lincoln came away with 400,000 more, and was reelected as the President of the United States to continue his work of implementing our namesake and making the nation united. In today's episode, we covered the Gettysburg Address, Wilson's advocacy for the use and then conditions of black soldiers. We discussed the election of 1863, Wilson's son Henry Hamilton, Sherman's March to the sea, and we ended on the election of 1864. If you have any questions, shoot me an email at HenryWilsonPodcast@gmail.com. And if you're interested in learning more or supporting the show, head to HenryWilsonHistory.com. I look forward to finishing off the series in the coming weeks and continuing through the life of Henry Wilson.